The hall was built to make visitors feel small. It worked. Lena Okafor had been to 41 diplomatic meetings across 9 star systems. She had sat in rooms carved from asteroid cores, rooms that floated in gas giant atmospheres, rooms that smelled like sulfur and old starlight. She had learned 6 alien languages by ear, without software, the way you learn a song, by listening until it lives somewhere in your chest and you stop thinking about it. None of those rooms had made her feel the way this one did. Conclave Station 11's main chamber rose 400 feet above her head. The ceiling was carved silicon crystal, lit from the inside, the light shifting through slow cycles of color that humans did not have names for. 17 alien species sat along a table that curved wide at the far end and narrowed toward the near end. The human delegation sat at the narrow end. 4 chairs, slightly smaller than every other chair at the table. Nobody had made them smaller on purpose. Probably. Lena set her datapad flat on the table. She straightened her jacket. She looked at the glass of water in front of her. The water didn't move right. The station's gravity ran a fraction below Earth standard, and the surface of the water sat too flat, too still, like something that had already decided nothing interesting was going to happen here. She looked away from it. Vale of the Get Sovereignty sat at the center of the table's long curve. Vale was tall and pale gray and looked at everything with the focused patience of someone doing long division in their head. Not hostile. Never hostile. The Get did not do hostile. They did something quieter, and harder to argue with. They did certain. The translation matrix hummed at low frequency around the room. A sound like being inside a very large, very calm machine. Lena stood up. She had worked on the statement for 9 months. The Terran Senate had reviewed it 11 times. 3 versions had been rejected. This one, the one in her hands right now, was the most careful thing she had ever written in her life. Trade equity. Shared defense perimeters. Resource corridor access. A full partnership framework that gave the sovereignty everything they had ever wanted from humanity while asking for, she felt, a deeply reasonable amount in return. She read it out loud. It took 14 minutes. Her voice stayed even. She had practiced being even. When she finished, she sat down. The room was quiet for 17 seconds. She counted. Then Vale spoke. The translation matrix rendered it in a smooth, patient voice. The words were technically polite. The grammar was formal. Every sentence was built the way you build a wall, stable, complete, and going nowhere. What Vale said was this. Humanity was a young species. Its recorded history was short. Its biological lifespan was brief. It had no psionic ability, no hive mind architecture, no multi-generational memory structure. Its psychological stability, according to sovereignty observation records, was tied to social systems that had shown historical fragility under large-scale pressure. The Get Sovereignty had reviewed the Terran proposal with full attention. They would not be countering it. Humanity was welcome to exist within its current boundaries. It was not welcome to expand them. Not to the shared defense grid. Not to the corridor routes. Not to the joint research frameworks. It could submit another petition in 200 years, at which point the sovereignty would review humanity's progress and decide whether further engagement was appropriate. Humanity, Vale explained, was not weak. That word assumed a standard had been set and failed to reach. Humanity had simply not yet arrived at one. The 15 other delegations at the long end of the table did not object. They did not shift in their seats. They looked at their own datapads, or at the ceiling, or at each other. Not at Lena. She looked at her glass of water. It still didn't move. She thought, with the one part of her brain that had gone quiet and cold and very focused, that she had spent 9 months writing the most careful thing she had ever written, and it had been heard the way you hear a housefly. Not with cruelty. Not with contempt. With the complete absence of concern. She picked up her glass. Drank from it. Set it back down. Thank you, she said, into the translation matrix. It was the most frightening thing she had said all year. The meeting closed with procedural courtesy. Times and channels for future low-priority contact were exchanged. The sovereignty's assistant logged the session as completed. The human delegation was escorted, pleasantly, by station staff who smiled in whatever way their species used for smiling, back to the docking corridor. Nobody said much on the shuttle back to the Terran relay ship. Lena sat by the window and watched Conclave Station 11 shrink behind them. It was beautiful. All that carved crystal, all that slow cycling light, all that careful, immovable certainty built into every surface. She hated it the way you hate something that doesn't notice you hating it. Cole Navarro received the transmission 3 hours later, in his ready room aboard the relay ship. He was 58 years old and looked at a wide, quiet face, hands that had been broken twice and healed without complaint, gray at the temples and in the stubble on his jaw. He had grown up in a small Texas town where his father worked a coal seam and his mother taught 4th grade. The combination had given him a voice that never rose, eyes that were always watching, and a deep personal suspicion of anyone who talked a great deal when they had nothing good to say. He read the full transcript of the summit. Read it once. He did not read it again. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold while he was reading. He drank it anyway. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his ready room. The ship hummed around him. Outside the viewport, open space ran in every direction, no color, no sound, nothing but distance. He set down the mug. He reached for a different channel on his comm panel. Not the standard fleet relay. Not the diplomatic line. The one that did not route through any conclave relay at all. The one that went point to point, encrypted, direct to a facility that did not appear in any conclave registry. The one that went straight to the shipyards. Well, he said, to no one in particular. He opened the channel. All right then. In the diplomatic corridor of the relay ship, Lena was still in her jacket, sitting on the edge of a bunk in her quarters, pen in her hand. A physical pen. Nobody used them anymore. She used one because she thought better with something real in her hand. She was not writing anything. She was clicking the pen open and closed. Open and closed. She thought about the water in the glass. About how it sat too flat. About how 17 seconds of silence could feel like a door closing somewhere deep in a building you could not find your way back out of. She thought about the word Vale had used. Standard. She clicked the pen one more time. Then she put it in her pocket and lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time, and the ship carried all of them back toward Earth at a speed that was, by galactic measurement, not particularly impressive. The audit was supposed to be routine. That was what the paperwork said. Routine review of the Terran Orbital Construction Division, standard budget cycle, no special access required beyond clearance level 9. Petra Morse had done 14 of these reviews in her career. Fuel processing stations. Communications relay hubs. Satellite manufacturing platforms. One very cold outpost in the asteroid belt that smelled like recycled air and slow, patient loneliness. None of them had required their own appointment 3 weeks in advance. Danny Kowalski met her at the docking collar of Construction Bay 1 with a handshake that felt like grabbing a socket wrench and a cup of coffee he had made for her without asking whether she wanted one. You'll want it, he said. He was 47, built like someone who had spent 30 years in zero gravity doing things that required their whole body, wide forearms, a jaw that looked structurally installed, hands that had the careful stillness of hands that knew how much force things took. His work uniform had a name tag. Below his printed name, someone had written in marker, Bay Chief since forever. Petra took the coffee. How many facilities are we covering today? She asked. Danny said, 1. He started walking. The corridor from the docking collar to the first hangar took 11 minutes on foot. Petra filled the time with standard audit questions, construction timelines, operational staffing, material sourcing by quarter. Danny answered all of them. His answers were short and accurate and contained exactly the information she had asked for, not one word more. She noticed he kept touching a bolt on the wall panel at each corridor junction. Not fixing it. Just adjusting it slightly with his thumb and forefinger, then moving on. She counted 3 junctions before she stopped counting. Then they reached the first hangar door. The door was large. Petra had seen large doors. Shipyard facilities had large doors. She adjusted for this. Danny keyed it open. The space on the other side was not a room. It was a volume. Her brain tried to process it as a room, tried to locate a far wall, tried to find a ceiling, and failed. The way your eyes fail when you look straight up at the sky and try to find the top of it. The ship inside the hangar was 4.2 kilometers long. Her brain tried to process that too. The hull was deep gray, not painted, the metal itself carrying the color the way old stone carries shade. The scale of the ship made the hangar's own support structures look like furniture in a cathedral. 12 docking gantries ran along its length, each one larger than most commercial orbital platforms she had ever inspected. The bow alone, just the nose, just the forward 300 meters, was wider than the entire docking ring of Conclave Station 11. Petra said nothing for a long time. Danny stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. "The Gideon Clay," he said. "Bay 7, Port Section, Position 1. Finished. Has been finished for 8 months. We've got 11 more just like her in this bay." She looked at him. He looked at the ship. "Classified as a deep space geological survey platform," he said. "Survey instruments on the stern. Rock hammer on a bracket mount. My grandfather put it there in 2196. She asked how many ships there were. Danny reached for the bolt on the nearest wall panel. It did not need adjusting. He adjusted it. She asked a different way. "How many bays across all facilities?" He said, "Across all 12 Terran orbital rings, the 16 lunar facilities, the 4 Martian stations, the asteroid belt platforms, the deep field construction corridors at L4 and L5, and 6 locations I am not going to name in this room." He stopped. Picked up his datapad. Handed it to her. She read the number. The bolt fell out of Danny's hand and hit the floor, and he did not move to pick it up for a long moment. He just looked at the Gideon Clay. 500,412, he said. "Give or take. The Kowalski 8-yard is finishing 3 more by end of week." He bent down. Picked up the bolt. Went back to adjusting it. "My grandfather took the contract in 2181, he said. Right after the Sovereignty's first contact report. You know what that report said? It said humanity was too short-lived, too psychologically fragile, too developmentally early to be worth full conclave engagement. Filed us as low-priority observation." Petra said, "And the Senate's response was to build 500,000 warships." Danny almost smiled. It was a small thing, and it did not last long. The Senate's response, he said, was a budget line inside a civilian infrastructure bill. Line 7441. Subsection C, Speculative Long-Term Defense Architecture. He paused. Nobody reads that far into a civilian infrastructure bill. That was the point. He looked back at the Gideon Clay. The ship was so large that the far end of it, the stern, where the rock hammer sat on its bracket mount, was in low light, barely visible. Just the outline of something built with impossible patience over an impossible amount of time. "My dad died in a hull breach in 2187, Danny said. Bay 9. Pressure seal failed on a weld joint during a live test. 3 people. Dad was one of them." He said it the way you say a number. Flat. Familiar. "His name's on a plaque in the Gideon Clay's engine room," he said. "I put it there myself. Not protocol. Just 62 years of people building things they hoped nobody would ever need. You want something to show for that. You want the people who didn't make it out to at least be in the room." Petra looked at the datapad again. At the number. 500,000. "What happens," she said, "if the Sovereignty still says no? After all of this?" Danny put the bolt in his pocket this time. He looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had been building things in the dark for 30 years and had made peace with the dark so long ago he barely remembered it being unfamiliar. "Then we show them," he said. He started walking back toward the corridor. 62 years ago, he said, not slowing down, the Senate read a report that told them humanity didn't meet the standard. Said we were too small, too short-lived, too unstable. He stopped at the next junction. Touched the bolt on the wall panel. Kept going. We didn't argue. We didn't file a protest. We didn't hold a press conference. He stopped at the hangar door and looked back one more time at the Gideon Clay. At the 12 gantries. At the 11 other ships just like her, sitting in the dark of the same bay, waiting. We went to work, he said. He turned the corner. Petra stood at the hangar door for a minute after he left. She stood there with her datapad and her coffee, which had gone cold, looking at a ship built by a man's grandfather, named by that man, carrying that man's dead father's name in its engine room. She thought about the word speculative in that budget line. Speculative long-term defense architecture. Speculative. As if the people who wrote it were not sure the species would survive long enough to need it. As if they had built it anyway, because that was what you did when you were told you hadn't reached a standard. You got up the next morning and you went to work and you kept going until the standard was a problem you had solved. She drank the cold coffee. She followed Danny back down the corridor, and the sound of her footsteps was very small in a very large place, and somewhere in the distance, deep in the Kowalski 8-yard, 3 more ships were being finished before the end of the week. 10 years is a long time to carry something without putting it down. Lena had not put it down. She was 44 now, which meant she had been 34 when she sat at the narrow end of a table on Conclave Station 11 and said thank you to the most precise and complete dismissal of her career. She had a silver streak in her hair, left temple, that a doctor had offered to treat 3 times. She had said no 3 times. She kept it the way you keep a scar you have stopped being embarrassed about, not as a wound anymore, just as a true thing on your face. The transmission room on the Terran diplomatic relay station was not large. 2 chairs. A main console. A secondary board where Nora Vasquez sat running signals with the quiet focus of someone who had learned early that the most useful thing you can be in a room full of pressure is steady, because the board needs you steady and it does not care how you feel about what's happening. Nora was 26. Her family was from Albuquerque. She had grown up watching Earth-to-Belt relay transmissions with her grandmother, had wanted to run a signals board since she was 9, and had wanted to do it for something that mattered ever since the day she was old enough to understand what the sovereignty's developmental classification actually meant for her planet and everyone on it. She ran the board the way she always ran it. No wasted movement. Eyes forward, hands moving, mind just ahead of both. Lena sat at the main console with a pen in her hand. A physical pen. She clicked it open. Clicked it closed. She had requested a direct channel to Conclave Station 11 through the standard diplomatic line 12 days ago. The channel had been opened that morning. The sovereignty's response time had been polite and unhurried, which was how the sovereignty did everything. She opened the channel. The translation matrix engaged. Its familiar low hum filled the small room. On the other end, several light minutes away, the Conclave's receiving station registered an incoming human diplomatic contact and flagged it as low priority. It had been flagging all human contacts as low priority for a decade. The algorithm had never been updated. Lena held the pen still in her left hand. She delivered the message in 3 parts. The first part, the Terran Confederation formally notified the Get Sovereignty that the developmental classification assigned to humanity in 2241 was considered by the Terran Senate, by unanimous vote, to be insufficient. The boundary determination attached to that classification was similarly considered insufficient. These were not complaints. They were stated positions, delivered through the correct diplomatic channel, on record. She clicked the pen once. Set it flat on the console. The second part, the Terran Confederation was requesting a new summit. Full conclave attendance. All 16 member species. Neutral location, the sovereignty's choice. The request window was 60 days from the date of this transmission. She left a pause. Not for dramatic effect. Because the next part needed its own space, its own moment of air around it, so the matrix would render it cleanly. The third part, should the sovereignty decline, the Terran Confederation wished to inform all 16 conclave member species that what followed would not be an act of aggression. It would be a demonstration of the standard they had been told humanity had not reached. The matrix processed it. On the other end, someone had made a decision. Someone at the sovereignty's receiving station had looked at the content of this transmission and decided it was not low priority after all. Vale's channel opened. Vale personally. This was not normal. This had not happened in 10 years of human diplomatic contact. Vale's voice came through the matrix with the same measured precision Lena remembered. 11 harmonics in the translation render. Like something very old and very sure of itself speaking at half speed because it had nowhere it needed to be. Vale asked what humanity intended to demonstrate. Lena picked up the pen. She said, "We'd rather show you." 17 seconds of silence. Then Vale said the sovereignty was declining the summit. Furthermore, this communication, because it formally attempted to alter the terms of an existing classification, would be logged as a petition action, resetting the review calendar. Humanity could submit a new request in 190 years. Then the Matrix rendered something that took a moment to identify. Laughter. Soft. 17 harmonics, descending. Not sharp. Not cruel. The kind of laughter that comes from a place of such complete security that it is almost warm, the way you laugh at a small animal that has puffed itself up to twice its size, not because you want to hurt it, but because it is, genuinely, a little charming. The channel closed. The room was quiet except for the board. Nora's hands did not stop. Her eyes kept moving. She said nothing. Lena set the pen flat on the console. She did not pick it up again. She sat with the laugh for a moment. Not the dismissal, she had lived with dismissal for 10 years and built a kind of armor from it. The laugh was different. The laugh was real. No performance in it. Vale had heard everything she said and found it genuinely, sincerely amusing in the way you find something amusing when it has absolutely no idea what it is walking into. Which meant the sovereignty still did not know. Which meant everything Danny had built, 62 years of work across 12 orbital rings and 16 lunar facilities and 6 locations that nobody named in any room, had stayed hidden from every conclave telescope and sensor array and observation report. Which meant the demonstration was still a surprise. She had made herself believe this in pieces. She had not let herself believe it all at once until this moment. She breathed in. Breathed out. "Nora," she said. Nora's hands were already positioned. She had been waiting for her name since the channel closed. "Do I send the signal?" she asked. Lena looked at the pen on the console. At the board behind Nora, its indicators running green across every channel. At the door, which was just a door, behind which was just a corridor, behind which was a ship that would carry this signal through a relay chain that had been laid quietly, connection by connection, over 62 years, routing nowhere near any conclave infrastructure. She thought about the water in the glass. 10 years ago. Still. Too flat. Too certain of its own stillness. She put the pen in her pocket. "Send it," she said. Nora sent it. It was a short signal. 17 characters, encoded, moving at transmission speed through a point-to-point chain that had been built the way everything human had been built these past 6 decades, quietly, in subsection C of civilian budget lines, by people who showed up before sunrise and did not explain themselves. The signal reached Cole Navarro in his ready room in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Cole read it once. He set down his coffee. He reached for the fleet-wide command channel. Not a relay. Not a diplomatic line. The direct channel, full encryption, to all 12 orbital rings, all 16 lunar facilities, the Martian stations, the belt platforms, the deep field construction corridors, and 6 locations with no names in any registry the Conclave had ever filed. To every dock where a ship sat finished, engines cold, waiting. He did not make a speech. Cole Navarro had never been a man for speeches. He had grown up watching his father go down a coal seam before the sun came up every morning of his working life without once saying anything about it that could be called remarkable. The work was the thing. Showing up was the thing. The speech was what other people needed before they could start. His father had never needed one. Neither did he. He pressed the key. He said, "Let's go to work." That was the whole order. 7 words. No preamble. No call to glory, no reminder of what was at stake, no names of the fallen or the waiting or the afraid. Just, let's go to work. Across 400,000 kilometers of human construction, from the nearest orbital ring to the farthest platform in the deep field, lights that had been running in maintenance amber cycled to operational white. 500,000 engines began their startup sequences. From the outside, from any conclave telescope pointed at the Sol system in that moment, it would have looked like the star was changing. Like something behind it had woken up. Like it had drawn a slow, enormous breath. and was now deciding whether to speak. They did not come out screaming. That was the first thing the sovereignty's long-range array registered, and in some ways it was more troubling than screaming would have been. Screaming meant fear or rage, and the Conclave's wargame models were very good with both. The models had been built and refined over centuries by species that had been fighting each other, and then not fighting each other, and then building elaborate systems to make sure they did neither again. The models knew what to do with screaming. What came out of warp at the sovereignty's border was not screaming. The ships arrived in formation. Perfect formation, columns so straight and so deep that the array's first reading was not individual ships at all. It was a shape. Something geometric, something vast, spreading slowly across 3 astronomical units of sovereignty border space like an open hand. The array began building a rendered image, the way it always did during fleet events, pixel by pixel as data resolved. It took 19 seconds. In those 19 seconds, on Conclave Station 11, no one spoke. Vale was in the observation dome. It was a personal habit, standing in the dome's full-sphere crystal wall when something significant was being processed by the array. At this distance there was nothing to see directly. The fleet was many light-minutes out. What the dome showed was only the array's own rendered image, projected on the interior surface, filling in as new data arrived. Vale watched the shape fill in. Column after column after column after column. Row after row. The rendering software, designed for fleet events, calibrated against every engagement the Conclave had recorded in 4 centuries, began to produce an uncertainty overlay. Small orange boxes at the edges of the formation. It meant the software had run out of expected range. Not sensor range. The edge of the fleet was well within sensor range. Expected range. The programmers who built the software had defined a boundary for what a fleet could be, because no fleet in 4 centuries had pushed past that boundary, and so the software had never needed a larger frame. The edge of this fleet was outside the frame. Vale stood at the dome window for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then sat down. Nora Vasquez, on the signals board of the Terran relay ship, had her secondary screen tracking a single vessel, the Gideon Clay, port column 3, position 7 in the formation. She had pulled its construction record 2 weeks ago. Bay 7. Chief Engineer, Danny Kowalski. Completed 8 months before deployment. Survey instrument on stern, 1 rock hammer, bracket mount, installed 2196. Her primary board was running at full load and demanding both her hands and most of her mind. She kept the secondary tracker open anyway. She did not spend time thinking about why. She just kept it there, one small blue marker among 412,000 others, each one a ship, each one built by somebody's family across 62 years of early mornings and cold coffee and names on plaques in engine rooms. The fleet held position at the sovereignty border and waited. Vale requested a direct channel to the Terran fleet. Cole took the call in his command chair. He did not stand for it. He was in a gray jacket. Not because anyone had told him to wear one or not wear one. He had just arrived in a gray jacket that morning, looking like someone who had done something very large once and was now mostly thinking about lunch, and nobody had said anything about it because they were all thinking about the same things he was thinking about, just louder. Vale's voice came through the translation matrix. Vale asked what humanity wanted. Cole said, same thing we asked for 10 years ago. New summit. All 16 species. Neutral ground. Your choice of location. 60 days. A pause. Vale asked what would happen if the sovereignty refused again. Cole was quiet for a moment. Not because he was thinking about his answer, he had his answer ready. He was giving the moment the right amount of space before he used it. You don't actually want to find out, he said. And I don't actually want to show you. So let's not do this the hard way. He let that sit for a second. These ships are not here to take anything from you. We did not build 500,000 dreadnoughts to start a war. We built them so that when we sat down at a table with you, we were worth sitting down with. So that you would talk to us like we had reached a standard. Because we have. The gravity shadow of 500,000 ships, each one 4.2 kilometers of dense alloy and drive core, was measurable on instruments across 11 sovereignty systems. The nearest of their stars flickered on sensors. Not because of any weapon. Simply because that much mass in formation bends the light around it at the edges, the way a crowd of people can cast a shadow that doesn't look like any one of them. The whole conclave could measure it. They were measuring it right now. "We will have an answer for you within the hour," Vale said. The channel went to standby. Cole reached for his coffee. Cold. He drank it anyway. Nora watched the tracker. The Gideon Clay held position, steady, running lights cycling at standard interval. Out on the stern, somewhere she could not see, a rock hammer sat on a bracket mount because Danny's grandfather had been a thoroughman who understood the value of paperwork and had made sure the survey instrument was real and properly mounted. She thought about that a great deal more than the situation seemed to call for. She thought about the fact that it was still there. That nobody had removed it. That you could build the most powerful ship in human history and still have a rock hammer bolted to the outside of it because 62 years ago a man filed the right form in the right subsection of the right civilian budget bill, and now here it was, light minutes from the Get Sovereignty's border, doing its part. The Sovereignty's answer came in 47 minutes. Vale's channel reopened. Vale said, "The Sovereignty will consider the summit request." Cole said, 60 days. Vale said, "Understood." The channel closed. On the bridge, people exhaled. Some of them had been holding their breath for so long they had stopped noticing. One navigation officer named Eli, 23 years old, from Portland, 16 hours into his shift on 3 hours of sleep, put his forehead down on his console for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked it back up and went back to work, because the board did not care that you had just watched 500,000 ships change the shape of the galaxy a little. The board needed you. Cole did not exhale. He breathed the same way he had been breathing the entire time, which was the way his father had breathed going down a coal seam, steady, unremarkable, not making a performance of the difficulty. He stood up. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the edge of space, where if you knew what you were looking at, you could trace the faint gravity shadow of the fleet. A geometry so vast it had its own quiet effect on the light from the nearest star. Not a weapon going off. Not a battle. Just a very large fact sitting at a border, politely, waiting for someone to draw the right conclusion. He thought about his mother grading papers at the kitchen table in a small house in a small town. He thought about his father coming home with coal dust in the lines of his hands and not saying much, because the day had been the day and there was tomorrow to think about. He wondered what his father would have made of this. He decided his father would have looked at the sensor display, 500,000 blue markers in perfect columns, 3 astronomical units of human work sitting at a border and changing the light of a star just by being there, and nodded once, and said something like, "Well, that's a lot of ships." And then gone to bed, because you still had to sleep. Cole almost smiled. He went back to his chair. "Hold formation," he said. "Nobody moves until the summit date is confirmed in writing and on record." Nora minimized the Gideon Clay's tracker to a quarter of her secondary screen. Not all the way. She told herself she would close it when they had the written confirmation. She left it open for now. Just the small blue marker, holding position, running lights cycling, rock hammer on the stern. Doing its part, the table was round. That was the first thing Lena noticed when she walked into the summit room on Arantha. A round table. No narrow end. No long curve that collected the powerful at one side and left the other side to the rest. No chairs slightly smaller than the chairs around them. Just 16 seats of the same size arranged in a circle, with nothing at the center except an empty space that belonged to no one. Someone had thought about this. She did not know who. She did not ask. She found her seat, sat down, and placed her pen flat on the table in front of her. She left it there. Did not pick it up. Arantha had been a neutral meeting world for 1100 years. Its atmosphere ran thin and cold, which was the whole point. Every species in the room was mildly uncomfortable, which meant every species in the room was on equal footing. The conference hall was low-ceilinged and plain. No carved crystal. No slow cycling colors that humans did not have names for. Just walls and a table and the same gray light that came through the windows from Arantha's pale sky. Cole was not in uniform. He had arrived in a gray jacket again, because it was what he had and it fit. He looked like someone's grandfather who had done something large once and was now in the part of life that comes after doing large things, tired in a settled way, not an unhappy way. All 16 species were present. Some of them had been at the first summit. The one with the 400-foot ceiling in the water that sat too still. They did not mention that. Neither did Lena. The conclave's chief archivist opened the formal session. The archivist was very old, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades recording what other people do while doing very little yourself except watching and writing it down. The archivist's job today was procedural, to formally revise the developmental classification of humanity in the conclave's permanent archive, which was the oldest continuous record in known galactic history. It took 6 minutes of formal procedure. Classification reviewed. Prior designation noted. Observation data updated. Proposed new designation entered. Then the archivist stopped. Looked across the round table. At Lena. Then at Cole. Then back at Lena. Does the Terran delegation, the archivist said, through the translation matrix, understand what the new designation means within the conclave's archive context? Lena said, tell us. The archivist said, the conclave archive holds records of 412 recognized species. Of those, 389 have received a developmental classification at some point in their history. Every one of those classifications resolved, upward, into recognized standing, or downward, into decline. No species in 400 years of record has remained in an intermediate state long enough to require a category that did not already exist. A pause. Humanity required a new category. Lena said, what is it? The archivist said the word first in get, which carried harmonics the matrix could not fully translate. Then the matrix gave its best rendering. Unresolved. The room was quiet for a moment. It means, the archivist said, that the conclave does not know what humanity will do next. That our models do not contain you. That you exist outside our expected range in ways our archive has not been designed to account for. Lena thought about the rendering software on the Sovereignty's long-range array. The orange uncertainty boxes at the edges of the fleet, where the frame had run out because nobody had built the software to expect a number that large. Good, she said. The archivist entered the designation. The file was closed. Then it was opened again. 11 of the 16 species had submitted framework requests. Trade access. Defense corridor sharing. Joint research exchange. Medical data collaboration. Deep field exploration partnerships. The same framework Lena had written 9 months 12 years ago, and watched set aside without a counter. They worked through 7 of the 11 frameworks that day. At the end of the session, as delegations moved through the corridor toward the docking areas, Vale's deputy appeared beside Lena. Quietly. Not interrupting. Just there, suddenly, walking at the same pace. The deputy held out a small translation device, personal, hand-carried, not the room matrix. Vale had sent a message. Lena took the device. We did not believe you were weak, the device rendered. We believed you were temporary. That was our error. Lena held it for a moment. She thought about temporary. About what that word meant to a species with multi-generational memory and 1,000-year institutional records and hive mind continuity that stretched back before humanity had writing. To look at a species with short lives and loud disagreements and no collective consciousness, and see temporary. She thought about Danny's grandfather taking a contract in 2181. About a name on a plaque in an engine room. About a rock hammer on a bracket mount on the stern of a ship currently parked 6 light years away, holding formation, waiting for written confirmation. She said, we believed it too, for a while. She gave the device back. She found Cole at the far end of the corridor, near the exit, where an Aranthian vendor had set up a small food stand. Cole was standing in front of it with a container of something that steamed faintly and had the smell of old grain and something that had been sitting in salt for longer than was comfortable to think about. He was poking at it with the provided utensil with the expression of a man who had stared down the Get sovereignty without raising his voice and was now genuinely, sincerely uncertain about fermented Aranthian paste. Lena stood next to him. He offered her some. She said no. He poked at it again. Ate some. Made no expression about it one way or the other, which could have meant it was fine or could have meant he had decided not to give it the satisfaction of a reaction. 7 frameworks, he said. 7 so far, she said. He nodded. Danny already sent a reallocation proposal. For the fleet. Lena looked at him. Hospitals, Cole said. Research platforms. Colony transports. He says the hulls are good and the engines are good and there's no reason to leave them parked. She thought about what it would take to move 500,000 ships from one purpose to another. The math of it. The years of it. What about the Gideon Clay, she asked. Cole said, she stays commissioned for now. Danny didn't say why and I didn't ask. Lena understood that without needing more. Far from Arantha's thin air and round table, back in Earth orbit, Danny Kowalski was in Bay 7. He had been awake for 22 hours. This was normal for him. He stood beneath the Gideon Clay's hull with a datapad in his hand, reading through the reallocation framework, what it would take to convert a warship to a hospital platform, what the power routing would require, how long per ship, how many ships per year, what the total timeline looked like if you ran all 12 rings at full conversion capacity simultaneously. He did the math. He put the datapad in his pocket. He went to the engine room. His father's name was on the third plaque from the left, south wall, at the level where the first pressure seal ran. The plaque was plain, name, date, position. The metal around it was lighter in color than the metal of the plaque itself, because Danny's hand had been touching that spot for years, the warmth and oil of his skin gradually changing the surface of the wall around his father's name in a way that would outlast him. He put his hand on it now. He stood there for a moment the way you stand somewhere when there is nothing left to do except be there. Then he went back to work. The thing the archivist had called unresolved was the most accurate word any other species had ever put on humanity. Not weak. Not strong. Not developed. Not primitive. Not temporary. Unresolved. A species that built things it hoped never to use. A species that carried its dead into its machines and kept going. A species that could be told it had not reached a standard and respond not with argument, not with anger, but with 62 years of quiet work and a rock hammer on the stern of the biggest ship anyone had ever built, because the paperwork required one survey instrument and that was what was available and it was good enough. The Gideon Clay's engines were warm. The rock hammer was on its bracket near the stern, right where it had always been. The plaque was on the south wall. The lights in the bay were white and operational, all the way on. And in a corridor on a neutral world, while 11 species worth of frameworks waited in a room that had a round table and no narrow end, Cole Navarro poked at fermented grain paste and said nothing very much, and Lena Okafor stood next to him and said nothing very much, and Arantha's pale sun moved across its thin sky, and the work that came after the large thing was already starting. It always started. That was the part nobody ever put in the models. That no matter what the answer was, yes or no, summit or border standoff, round table or narrow end, humanity had always already started the next part of the work. That was what unresolved meant. That was what it had always meant.